Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Paige, for that introduction. I thank Antine Clapp, Kristen Hoskins, and Paige for inviting me. I also deeply appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you in the audience this afternoon. And I also want to congratulate Antine and her co-curators, Baron Ebert and Robert Schindler, for this incredible exhibition on the extraordinarily gifted artist Rachel Ruysch. So this afternoon, I'm going to sort of ease our way into this lecture on a related topic. And by doing so, I want to share with you a bit of my personal experience from a couple of years ago. In the spring of 2023, the Yale University Art Gallery opened an exhibition entitled Crafting Worldviews, Art and Science in Europe, 1500 to 1800. It was a project I co-created with Paola Bertucci, a professor in the history of science and medicine at Yale. With objects from across Yale University's various cultural heritage units showcased in this exhibition, Paola and I demonstrated the inseparable relationship between art, science, and European colonialism from the 16th through the 18th century, an era usually called the early modern period, which is marked by voyage, trade, and Europe's territorial dominance on a global scale. The objects included in the exhibition reveal histories of invention and appropriation, consumption and exploitation, and collaboration and conflict. The exhibition demonstrated how art and science in Europe contributed to the shaping of Eurocentric worldviews, whose legacy continues to be felt and experienced today. So here I'm showing you a couple of installation photos of the exhibition galleries to give you a sense of the show. The topic of colonialism and its legacy is not a simple one to present. Reflecting the complexities and sensitivities of the subject, my co-curator and I unpacked this theme in 6 sections. The 6 sections include Voyage as Conquest, workshops of scientific instrument makers as a site of generating social, economic, and political power, consumption of science as part of elite education and normalization of colonialism, and representations of the natural, terrestrial, and celestial worlds. The most exhilarating part of the project was assembling a wide variety of objects from several libraries and museums across Yale's campus, ranging from the familiar to the not so familiar. Some of the fascinating objects we selected include anatomical mannequins made from ivory, as you can see on the left here on the slide, which is actually only the size of my hand. It's tiny. And an orrery, which is on the right side, which is a model of the solar system in which you can turn a crank at the bottom to move the models of planets around the sun. Equally fascinating objects include an automaton clock in the form of Goddess Diana riding on a chariot, which actually still can be operated, meaning that once you activate it, the whole object moves forward. Diana's eyes literally oscillate, and her animal companions like a monkey and bird moves, and when the chariot stops, Diana releases her arrow. And on the right here are peep shows made from a series of hand-colored prints placed upright in a particular sequence to create views like a mini theater. Crafted from both locally and globally obtained materials, these objects are remarkable, not just for their exquisite design, but also for their intricate construction. Having worked on this project for 3 years, my co-curator and I had finally reached the tail end of the exhibition preparation period, with just 2 more weeks left until the exhibition opened in February 2023. We and our team of art handlers and other colleagues at the Yale Art Gallery spent the last weeks of the project installing nearly 100 objects. Here's a photograph of me and my co-curator Paola on the right, and a couple of our art handlers installing some works. Many of the works require small mounts and blocks to support them. So it was a laborious process to prepare the supporting mechanisms and place them at an optimal height and distance between the objects. A couple of days left before the exhibition opened, we were installing the final section of the show. We were trying to set up the very last display case, as you can see on the far left, that would house 2 illustrated books. Little did we realize, until we were trying to install both books, that we could display actually just 1 book. So that's the outcome that you see here on this photo. As a result, we had to make a game time decision on which book to display and which book to not display. Since the show concluded with a point of reflection on the legacies of European colonialism, we decided to go with the book opened to an illustration that was less visually complex than the image we had chosen for the other book, in order to give our visitors a moment to think before they leave the exhibition galleries. And so the question is, what about the book that did not make the cut just before the exhibition opened? So here's that book. First published in Dutch in 1706, this is an illustrated publication on the collection of Levinus Vincent the Younger, a textile merchant, and his wife, Johanna van Breda, a gifted embroiderer. This couple was a contemporary of Rachel Ruysch, and Levinus Vincent and Rachel's father, Frederick Ruysch, actually knew each other. Vincent and van Breda's collection was open to the public, who paid a fee to see it, and it was shown in Amsterdam, Haarlem, and The Hague as a family moved from one city to the next in a nearly 20-year period. It was known for the extraordinary number and a beautiful presentation of amassed primarily natural specimens, demonstrating the wonder of nature, the wonder of God's creation. God's limitless creativity, showcased in biodiversity, elicited awe, a framework of many collections from the period we call the early modern era. Reflecting this idea is the very title of this book. It can be translated as Theater of the Marvels of Nature or Wonder Theater of Nature. We will return to this publication later in this talk, but for now, I want us to dwell briefly on the word theater. Why would someone call their collection a theater? What is fascinating is that many publications dating to the 16th through the 18th century, especially those that concern maps, natural history, or collections, contain in their titles words like speculum, which originally means to observe or to mirror, thesaurus, originally meaning treasure or storehouse, or theatrum, or theater. These words reflect the idea that knowledge is formed through observation, collected in the form of a repository, and displayed in an order. In other words, they convey the idea that knowledge is the ordered representation of things. In this regard, quote-unquote theater is a place, physically and or figuratively, where knowledge of things that make up the world is displayed. It is where knowledge of the world is presented visually. Today we'll be taking a look at a number of works by Rachel Ruysch and other artists of her time to see how they visualized knowledge of the world, in particular, the natural world. We'll explore this topic in 5 parts. The first section, Knowing and Seeing Worlds, we'll talk about various ways of thinking about the world during the early modern period, especially the notion of microcosm. Part 2, Collecting Curiosities, Portraying Nature, we'll explore a close relationship between the practice of collecting objects of wonder and the emergence of flower paintings genre. In Part 3, we'll explore 3 key actions: cut, move, and assemble, involved in the creation of portrayals of nature, and we'll take a moment to apply those conceptual modes of composing a work to an image designed by Maria Sibylla Marian, a gifted artist and contemporary of Rachel Ruysch. In part 4, zooming in a microscopic vision, we will look at the early history of the microscope and how a new vision offered by that instrument shaped the way Rachel Ruysch approached her works. In the final section, pulling back the curtains, we'll take a closer look at the natural history collection of Levinus Vincent and Johanna van Breda and explore how Cabinets of Curiosities presented nature as a wonder theater. Through these 5 sections, my goal is to provide a framework that can help us deepen our understanding and appreciation of diverse portrayals of nature by Rachel Ruysch and her contemporaries, and to offer a point of reflection on the role our vision plays in creating small worlds of our own. Part 1, knowing and seeing worlds. For those of us who have gone through the Rachel Ruysch exhibition, one of the most marvelous findings we encounter is this painting produced around 1735, still life of exotic flowers on a marble ledge, from the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Visited by a couple of butterflies that are quite difficult to spot, this floral arrangement is a profusion of plants flaunting their spectacular forms and colors, various shades of red, white, orange, yellow, blue, and purple, facing a myriad directions and offering diverse views of flowers and stems illuminated by light coming from the upper left corner of the canvas. Thanks to the research of Dr. Charles Davis and his team, we now know that at least 36 plant species are represented in the painting, 21 of which, such as devil's trumpet, the carrion flower, creeping cactus, and Persian lilac from various regions in Asia, Australia, Africa, North and South Americas, including the Caribbean. The represented species would have come from many different places around the world in various habitats, and that to see them in bloom at the same time would not have been possible in real life. This botanical world that can only exist in the pictorial realm was likely possible thanks to Rachel's upbringing under a father who was an anatomist and botanist, her own network of naturalists and artists specializing in portraying nature, and her likely access to botanical gardens and associated libraries in Amsterdam. However, why would Rachel have portrayed such a painting that features flowers from numerous places around the globe? What could have been the thinking or a guiding principle behind her works like this, as well as of those of her contemporaries? To find answers to these questions, we'll take a step back for a moment and explore Europeans' understanding of the world during the early modern period. Like histories of many different cultures, European history is marked by dynamic relationships between people groups of Europe and those of distant locations, engaging in trade and exchanging knowledge and technology. Exchange and contact also entailed political, military, social, religious, and economic conflict. From the late 15th century onward, when kingdoms in Europe were entering into political, religious, and mercantile competition, as well as experiencing an increase in population, the ideals of ancient Roman Empire began to reemerge in the minds of rulers to advance their influence. One of the key shifts in their thinking about their domain is seeing land as property. That is, land is something one can hold, develop, transfer, or even dispose. Sovereignty came to be understood as a fundamentally territorial phenomenon. That is, land ownership equaled political power. The benchmark by which a ruler or a kingdom's power is measured is tied to how much land they took possession of. Moreover, land was something that could be understood in form, something that can be measured, and whose borders can be drawn and redrawn. Scientific instruments like octants and compasses enabled those at sea to stay on course as they embarked on maritime voyages across the seas, and other tools such as survey chains were used for measuring land. Maps of the terrestrial world with altitudes and latitudes laid out in grid-like form were beginning to emerge, with illustrations populating the margins as well as the lands and seas known and imagined. This approach can be also observed in the emergence of celestial maps, marked by the constellations first identified by the Babylonians and Greeks, with additional ones in the 1530s. Both the heavens and the earth, so to speak, were something that could be charted on a map. The world was increasingly becoming known through measurements and documentation, both mathematical and artistic. The changes in Europeans' understanding of the world emerged in their view of the human body as well. For centuries leading up to the 16th century, much of medical knowledge about the human body was anchored to theories laid out by Hippocrates, the 15th and 4th century BC physician, and it was further developed by the 2nd century Greek physician and philosopher, Galen. Hippocrates believed that the human body contained key fluids he called the 4 humors: phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that a healthy human body is that of the 4 humors in balance, and that illness is caused by the imbalance of any of these fluids. One's knowledge of the human body was based on Galen's authoritative text and not on observation. Dissection, thus, was rare and even discouraged. By the 1540s, a landmark publication by the Flemish physician Andreas Vesalius, called On the Fabric of the Human Body of 1543, or Fabrica for short from its Latin title, included corrections to errors in Galen's theories about the human body. His achievements are intertwined with dissections, as shown in the portrait of Vesalius on the left, dissecting an arm of a human. Dissecting the human body enabled direct observation and study of the human anatomy. While the popularity of Vesalius' Fabrica is owed in great deal to the many rich illustrations included in the book. The illustrations, such examples in the middle and right here, usually showed flayed bodies standing as if they are alive, or hanging to look like bodies of executed criminals. Echoing the growing number of maps of the terrestrial and celestial world, the human body was becoming more and more known and represented through documenting and illustrating the acquired knowledge of human anatomy from direct observation. For the purpose of this lecture, Vesalius' contribution to the history of Western philosophy is significant, as it serves as an example of an enduring idea that the human body as a little world or microcosm reflects the universe, the larger world. Likely originated in the 5th century BCE, with possibly some precedents in Asia, ancient Greek philosophers, including Plato, believed that truths about the nature of the universe mirrors truths about the nature of humans. A Christian interpretation of the human body as microcosms echoing God's creation, which is orderly and diverse, emerged in the medieval era and endured through the early modern period. That is, revelation of the human anatomy would reveal God's workings, and that it is in the human bodies, or miniature worlds, that God's universal design is reflected. In the dissected human bodies, that's what Vesalius saw. Such view of the human body as a miniature of God's creation echoed in Europeans' approach to nature as well. A theological view of nature, that is, nature as God's wondrous creation, remained fundamental to Europeans' understanding of it. What dissection would do for unveiling God's workings, as one discovers the details of the human body, or a microcosm, direct observation of nature, another manifestation of a microcosm through studying, experimentation, and collecting specimens would also yield the divine and his wondrous work, something that generations of anatomists, naturalists, and philosophers after Vesalius propounded. all of us may have heard or used the phrase, knowledge is power. This phrase is usually attributed to the English philosopher Francis Bacon, who authored a book entitled The Great Instauration, published in 1620. Bacon believed in the importance of acquiring knowledge through direct observation of nature as a key to scientific research. In his view, acquired knowledge is used to dominate the natural world and extract its resources. And this approach to knowledge acquisition informed the idea of scientific research as a hunt for the secrets of nature. Nature is not only where God's wondrous works is instilled, but it also needs to be known for the benefit and empowerment of humans. One of the examples from the early modern period that articulates this approach to nature is a publication commissioned by the Governor-General of the Dutch colony of Brazil, entitled The Natural History of Brazil. It was authored by Dutch and German naturalists Willem Piso and Georg Markgraf. The treatise details botanical, zoological, and ethnographical studies and characterizes Brazilian nature as pristine and copious, ripe for exploitation by colonizers. Reflecting this characterization is a title page, as you can see here, where Brazil is shown as a tropical land abundant with natural resources. It also shows the male and female figures of the local Tapuia people holding branches and their weapons. They are depicted with features different from the idealized European bodies to portray them as wild and untamed. Intertwined with new and re-emerging framework on terrestrial, celestial, anatomical, and natural worlds, against the backdrop of Europe's trade, territorial expansion, and material extraction on a global scale, the notion of microcosm, a miniature world echoing the bigger world, profoundly influenced early modern European thinking on what was becoming available to them, especially the wondrous representatives of nature and human workmanship. These representatives were gaining new meaning and being imbued with a new role. In the early modern period, they were not merely collectibles just because of their sheer availability in Europe. They represented something bigger than themselves for the beholder, especially the one who possessed them. Part 2, collecting curiosities portraying nature. This illustration presents the vast collection of an Italian nobleman named Ferdinando Cospi in Bologna. His collection comprised natural specimens and Greek and Roman antiquities, as well as rare examples of Mesoamerican art and manuscripts. Diverse collected items are arranged quite neatly and retain some degree of symmetry. A tall young man, who is right here, who is Cospi's grandson, stands at far right, inviting us to look and admire his grandfather's collection. His elongated body brings into sharp relief the acute physiognomic difference between him and another man standing prominently near the center, who is this person right here. That man, near the center of this room, is an individual affected by dwarfism named Sebastiano Biavati. Holding an Egyptian statuette in his left hand and a long stick in his right hand, Biavati was a custodian of Cospi's collection. But at the same time, he was regarded as a living marvel because of his physical condition. Scholars have diverging opinions on Biavati's reception in relation to Cospi, but one thing is clear. Cospi's collection is a microcosm of the rare, the novel, and the wondrous. Starting in the 16th century, the notion of a microcosm began to be most ostensibly expressed through collecting. By collecting, I mean amassing items generally categorized as natural specimens or naturalia, or human-made goods or artificialia. Naturalia included specimens of plants, vegetables, animals, insects, and humans in Europe and the rest of the world. And artificialia included scientific and musical instruments, contemporary and ancient works of art, artifacts, and goods imported from around the globe. As the Europeans' mercantile and colonial activities expanded, the range of items grew accordingly, and so did the activity of collecting. A 16th century painter and printer named Hubert Holtzius claimed to have visited 968 collections throughout Europe, from the Netherlands to Germany to Austria, Switzerland, France, and Italy from 1556 to 1560. Although the number of collections he claimed to have visited is likely exaggerated, it is illuminating for us to consider that already by the mid-16th century, collecting was a noteworthy phenomenon in Europe. The collection of the Italian nobleman Ferdinando Cospi in Bologna is one such example. Collecting wasn't a domain exclusively available to the princely. Holtzius's exaggerated numbers may clue us in here. Apothecaries, merchants, professors, and those of various professions were able to collect. For the princely, collecting objects from all known parts of the earth was a demonstration of their power, network, and influence that extends beyond the borders of their authority. For wealthy merchants, the learned, and those in other professions, collecting was a way of knowledge making and self-fashioning. For example, on the left is a collector, Ferrante Imperato, who was an apothecary in Naples, and his collection focused on natural specimens. On the right is a collection of the Danish physician, O. Verm, whose collection housed a variety of rare and ancient objects of art, along with natural specimens from around the world. These specimens and objects collectors amassed were considered representatives of their larger counterpart, a culture, a region, or climate, tradition, etc. To make sense of the hodgepodge of distributed signifiers of the larger concepts, a collector brings the collected into order according to their worldview or logic. The breadth and depth of collections are prioritized, and thus it is not uncommon to see collections, at least in the illustrations of them, oscillating between an organized space and a chaotic one. In the process, what was from the past was positioned comparatively or in contrast to the present, and so did what was made locally versus made from a far distant location. Therefore, gaps in time and physical distance between cultures were compressed and even erased in cabinets of curiosities. What should have belonged in a certain time or place comes together to create a new reality, a new world. In this sense, flower paintings, or still lifes more broadly, are closely linked with cabinets of curiosities. When it comes to the history of flower paintings genre in Europe, one way of understanding it is that this type of art had its foundation in the 15th century Netherlandish paintings and Flemish illuminated manuscripts, where highly detailed rendering of flora and fauna, as well as objects, are included in the compositions. A great example is a stunning painting by Rogier van der Weyde of St. Luke drawing the Virgin and Christ Child here at the MFA, which includes exquisite details of objects and nature. And the display here at the MFA actually presents this very beautifully. So I encourage you to go to the second floor if you haven't done so, to really explore this painting. While the Netherlandish penchant for naturalism in the 15th century could serve as an artistic foundation, it is not a coincidence that the flower painting tradition emerged precisely during a time which collecting informed by the early modern European notions of microcosm in the 16th century. What used to be relegated to the background or incorporated into biblical scenes, as we saw in this painting by van der Weyde, the earliest instances known of a flower painting as an independent genre in European art find themselves in the work of the German painter Ludwig Thomring the Younger, who resided in the Flemish port city of Antwerp in the early 1550s. This example at the Getty is a work from the early 1560s by Thomring, depicting a bouquet of Northern European florals such as roses, violets, rosemaries, and gillyflowers in an opaque white glass called latimo. Scholars believe that Tom Ring's time in Antwerp shaped his interest in the natural world. What we do know is that from around 1560, he started producing flower paintings, first to do so as an independent subject. This time cannot be more fascinating when we consider that the first treatise on collecting also appeared in the 1560s. Published in 1565, the publication is entitled, in short, Inscriptions, or Titles for the Most Ample Theater. So again, we're seeing this reoccurrence of theater in the title here. And it was authored by a Flemish physician named Samuel Kiesjeberg. Kiesjeberg wrote his treatise for Albrecht V, Duke of Bavaria, and this text was aimed to demonstrate that curiosity cabinets possess pragmatic value because by organizing collected objects, knowledge can be expanded and become more accessible, and stories can be created. And at the same time, the value of the objects increases. In so doing, Kiesjeberg inspired collectors to assemble their own collections. Flower painting's relationship with cabinets of curiosities can be further explored in the genre of so-called gallery painting. From what we know as of now, the gallery paintings genre emerged in the 16 teens in Antwerp, which became the hub of production of this type of painting throughout the 17th century. Most gallery paintings are imaginative and idealized depictions of collections, showing us a view of a room furnished with paintings, casts of well-known ancient sculptures, scientific and musical instruments, prints and drawings, ancient coins, porcelain, precious vessels, animals, shells, and other natural specimens. An example we're looking at here dates to 1612, the earliest known example of this type of painting, and it was painted by an artist named Franz Franken the Younger. Among several paintings, sculptures in buffet cabinet with shells sculpture, shells, parrots, and a dog and a monkey in this room, a couple of men are carefully examining a globe on the right. Directly across the room from these men stands a towering bouquet of flowers, as you can see here on the left. And what is fascinating is that this vase of flowers is an adaptation of an earlier flower painting by Jan Bruegel the Elder, son of the famous painter Peter Bruegel the Elder, whose genre paintings are well known. A side-by-side comparison between this detail of Franken's painting and Jan Bruegel the Elder shows that Franken captured key characteristics of Bruegel's composition of flowers and enlarged and brightened the Chinese porcelain vase for greater visibility. In fact, Franken included Jan Bruegel's bouquets in a number of his gallery paintings. Jan Bruegel's floral arrangement is an impossibility in the real world. The flowers he depicted in this composition cannot bloom at the same time, nor they come from the same region. Depicted among them are the common iris flower, which has long been a staple flora in European art, with a very rare type called the morning iris, or Iris Susiana from the Middle East, as well as various types of tulips, which were originally introduced to Europe from the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And speaking of tulips, note that this painting was made about 2 decades before the famous Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s, which Natasha Seaman at the next lecture will cover. However, this floral arrangement is possible within a pictorial realm, just like the fictive interior by Franz Franken that houses all kinds of objects from around the world. Such a portrayal of nature reflects microcosmic thinking during the early modern period. Part 3, cut, move, assemble. One of the first works we encounter in the Rachel Ruysch exhibition is this portrait of the artist, which she painted in collaboration with the portraitist Michiel van Muscher. Placed closest to us is a windowsill on which a drawing of a plant on blue paper and a pink rose cut from its original plant and visited by a butterfly rest. And you can see that detail way down here. Pressing down that drawing and the rose are 2 books, which are right up here. And on top of those books is a sketchbook right here, open to show an exquisite illustration of morning glory. Just behind all of these objects is the artist herself, holding in her left hand a palette with different colors of paint, a set of thin brushes, and a painter's stick to steady her hands when painting. With her right hand, she's picking up the stem of a poppy flower to assemble a bouquet that will become the subject of her next painting, as an empty canvas behind her suggests. In this picture, we can see 2 sets of activities happening simultaneously. One of cutting, moving, and assembling flowers, and the other of observing, studying, and portraying flowers. When we look at images of the natural world from the early modern period, we often marvel at the naturalism of plants and insects. What Rachel Ruysch's portrait offers us is that there's more to naturalism in portrayals of the natural world. The 2 intertwined sets of activities, one of cutting, moving, assembling, and the other of observing, studying, and portraying, may not easily be noticed, but it is these activities that are fundamental in creating images of the natural world. Close looking, literally and figuratively, can help us recognize them and see these images of nature anew. So let's start with arguably the most subtle detail in portraits of flowers, the cut stem. Following flower painters of previous generations, Rachel Ruysch included in her works these small features which can be easily overlooked. Once you notice these, it's very hard to unsee them. I show here just a couple of examples of cut stems Rachel Ruysch included in her paintings, and you can actually find these and more in the exhibition. Images of cut stems are also found in botanical drawings and published illustrations produced in many different regions in Europe. One example is this watercolor by Rachel's contemporary Alida Witthos of a plant known in Europe as Indian thornapple or devil's trumpet. As its name suggests, this plant is known to have originated from South America and then introduced to Europe via the Indian subcontinent in the 16th century. This plant belongs to genus Datura of trumpet-shaped flowers, and it can grow to 6 feet tall with multiple branches. However, Witthos' view shows that what is deemed most essential about the flower, the impressive size of its double bloom, which can be compared to a small bud below it. And you can see that small bud right there. And the petal's deep purple exterior and curly ends unfurling like flames. Also often overlooked feature in flower paintings is that the cut flowers defy gravity, such as in this example by Rachel Ruysch on the left. Anyone who has ever tried to put a bouquet of flowers in vases would know that vases need to be tall enough for the stem to lean on so that the flowers remain upright. In the painted floor arrangements, the vessels that hold different cut flowers are more often than not too small or too low to hold up the full weight of the stem and flowers of each specimen. The height of the flowers is so varied that there is no single vase that can realistically accommodate the varying length of all the stems of flowers. This way of presenting flowers is in keeping with a long-held tradition in the genre of flower paintings, such as works by Ambrosius Bosschaert, one of the earliest flower painters in the Netherlands. Whether or not the stems remain upright the way they do is less important than showcasing the flowers and leaves' diverse forms, shapes, and colors to create a visually pleasing whole, a process that prioritizes moving them in different orientations. Just as potent as moving the flowers in different orientations is assembling them. Throughout the Rachel Ruysch exhibition, we see companies like insects, reptiles, and amphibians, as well as nests with eggs inhabiting the same space as flowers, and in this case, fruits. In this detail of Ruysch's fruit piece from 1717, we observe several creatures, including the stag beetle on the right, crawling over toward the open pomegranate, a lizard on the left, turning its body to have a flying insect for a meal, and it's presented very dramatically, and a snail resting on a leaf. The assembly creates a whole little world. If we look at other types of portrayals of nature, something else comes into view. Alida Withos, whose work we saw a moment ago, was one of the several people who together produced a total of 425 beautiful botanical drawings for a 9-volume tome best known as the Monarch's Atlas, which is featured in the exhibition and named after its primary contributors, Jan and Maria Monarchs. Here are some examples of illustrations of a pineapple, a rose mallow, and a citrus medica representing the Americas, Asia, and the Mediterranean region. Taking over 20 years to complete and published over a 10-year period, this massive 9-volume collection of botanical illustrations was commissioned for Amsterdam's newly created Hortus Medicus, a medical herb garden. Whether they come in the form of a cut stem or a plant growing from a kind of soil, highly detailed depictions of botanical specimens are compositions that consist of flowers that too were removed from various contexts and presented to the viewer. While one may be in awe of the naturalistic rendering of the specimens, collectively, this assembly, a very meticulously orchestrated one, is only possible when they're taken out of their native region and made themselves across the pages of books in Europe. So cut, move, assemble. Now that we've explored these 3 activities, let's do a bit of visual exercise and look at an image from an extraordinary book by another contemporary of Rachel Ruysch, Maria Sibylla Marion. On a 2-year journey to the Dutch colony of Suriname in South America, Marion studied numerous plants and insects with the help of enslaved African and indigenous peoples there. She brought back to Europe the drawings of nature she made in Suriname that served as a basis for her groundbreaking 1705 publication, The Metamorphosis of the Insects of Suriname. An edition of this publication is included in the exhibition in the gallery, in the second gallery. There is a total of 60 illustrations in the book, and here I'm just showing you some of them. And take a look at these for a moment and share some of your observations or first impressions with a neighbor sitting next to you. And for those of you who don't have a neighbor sitting next to you, I hope you still can think of some first impressions as you're looking at these 3 images. So I'll give you a moment. So how did that go? I know this room's a little quiet, but I'm sure you have some first thoughts. So hold on to them. With this work, Miriam is credited as one of the first people in Europe to detail the life cycle of an insect and its interactions with plants. There are other types of creatures appearing in some illustrations. We'll be looking at the penultimate illustration in this book. This image shows a representation of the Suriname toad, or scientifically called biba biba. In this case, the mother and her babies. To understand this image better, it's helpful to know a bit about these toads. The male and female Suriname toads inhabit in slow or still waterways, such as streams, backwaters, and seasonal pools of water after flooding. They mate during fall and winter. The female, which measures about 4 to 8 inches, releases about 60 to 100 eggs, and the male fertilizes them and pushes them onto the female's back. The fertilized eggs stick to the female's skin, which grows around the eggs over the following few days and eventually closes them completely. After the eggs are hatched, the young toadlets stay on her back for 3 to 4 months for further growth and development. After that point, the fully formed toadlets push and squirm to loosen the female's skin, and the pockets of her back open up, and the toadlets leave their holes and swim towards the surface of the water to breathe air. So what we see in this image, designed by Marion, is a final phase of the toadlet's development before they become independent from their mother. And as you can glean from this image, the Suriname toad's reproductive process was deemed so unusual in the eyes of Europeans that it and the female toad's unique appearance became a topic of representation and a subject of examination. By the time Marion depicted this image of the Suriname toad, the specimens of this amphibian were well known by collectors in Europe, including Rachel Ruysch's father, Frederick Ruysch, who has several in his natural history collection. The specimens preserved in a jar containing alcohol show the female toad bearing eggs, immortalizing a specific period in the female's life cycle. Thanks to new research findings by one of the co-curators of the exhibition, Robert Schindler, we now know that Rachel Ruysch depicted the amphibian herself approximately 10 years before Marion did, likely because of the toad specimen in her father's collection. And you can see an image of Rachel Ruysch's drawing on the right here. Whether or not Marion knew about Rachel's portrayal of the Suriname toad is uncertain. According to a text that comes with this image, Marion noted that she examined it live in person. And then, when she saw the toads, quote, wriggling out of the mother's skin, one after another, as out of an egg, I threw the mother in brandy with its remaining young, of which some had their heads out, other half their body, end quote. But given the fact that it was familiar to collectors, she would have thought about how to present what is already known. What she chose to do was to include it as a company to the watercress plant, which is depicted in a style consistent with many of the previous illustrations of flowers, whose stem, leaves, and petals swirl and curve, forming beautiful compositions. The inclusion of the Suriname toad in this composition was a deliberate act. In her text, she noted that, quote, to complete my work on insects, an aquatic animal, or toad, will not go badly with this watercress, end quote. So she also added in 2 shells just next to the plant. The shell on the right is a turban shell, serving as a home to a hermit crab. This shell originates in the Indian Ocean near the coast of Southeast Africa. The shell on the left is likely a Cassidy helmet shell, a type that is found in tropical regions around the world. The 2 shells, as well as a hermit crab, are all residents of the sea. They do not belong to the habitat of the Suriname toad. By removing the toad, the flying watercress, and the 2 shells from their original contexts, moving them in certain orientations, and assembling them in a pictorial realm that would never exist otherwise, Marion created a microcosm, a new little world. So we'll shift gears now and explore a scientific instrument that reflected and invigorated early modern notions of microcosm. Part 4, zooming in a microscopic vision. Lenses had existed for centuries, but what we now call the microscope, an optical instrument with a lens in a tube, first appeared sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century in the Netherlands. According to a Dutch diplomat named Willem Boreel, the microscope was invented in Middelburg, where flower paintings emerged in the Netherlands and by a father and son named Hans and Zacharias Janssen. The word microscope comes from the Greek mikron, for small, and skopine, or to look at. A name first used by Galileo's friend, the botanist Giovanni Faber. We don't know exactly what this first microscope looked like, but again, according to Willem Boreel, the new instrument was made with a 1.5 foot gilded brass tube that is rising vertically from 3 legs. Another type of microscope also appeared in the early 17th century. It's called a compound microscope, and this one is actually on view in the Rachel Ruysch exhibition. The compound microscope comprises 2 optical parts: an eyepiece, which is a lens through which you directly look at an object, and the ocular, or the objective lens. The lenses in both areas were convex lenses, and the pairing of the 2 lenses made the microscope shorter than a single lens instrument, thus easier to use, while offering a broader field of vision. When microscopes were entering the world of medical practitioners, naturalists, and anatomists in the 17th century, the instrument received a mixed reception. There was a potential that the microscope could afford to the viewer, to the observer, the potential to see what could not be seen, and thus the possibilities of making new discoveries. This prospect led to a number of instrument makers and naturalists alike searching for ways to improve magnification of the microscope and thereby devising several forms of the instrument. Perhaps the most astonishing example is the glass quote-unquote droplets, which are beads made from glass as small as less than 1 millimeter in diameter and believed to increase magnification by the hundreds or, as some purported, thousands. Here, as an example of a replica of a simple microscope made by Antony van Leeuwenhoek. There's another version of such replica on display actually also in the Rachel Ruysch exhibition. These tiny glass beads would be secured to a plate made from brass or other materials, through which the observer would examine a specimen on the other side of the instrument. Leeuwenhoek has been credited as the discoverer of the spermatozoa, red blood cells, and bacteria, among others, through his use of the microscope. The Netherlands' most famous microscopist, Leeuwenhoek developed an interest in microscopic observation emerged when he was running a business in linen draping, and that he ground his own lens to make observation on threads through the microscope. His technique improved remarkably, surpassing that of naturalists of his time, to the point of garnering the attention and recognition of the prestigious Royal Society in London for his work. He is known to have owned 100 couple microscopes, which he newly constructed for the purpose of improving images of microscopic preparations, and had the instruments kept in some 150 small cases. He also spent much time preparing and securing specimens for examination under the microscope. So many of the specimens were prepared for such a purpose that he built a whole collection of his preparations alone, and people came to visit his collection. Whether they take on the form of single, compound, or droplets, microscopes in the 17th and 18th century were burdened with technical challenges. The lenses powerful enough to provide sufficient magnification were too difficult to make. During the process of making them, bubbles trapped within the glass with the curved surfaces of the lens and the lack of completely transparent, colorless results rendered microscopes difficult to use for different observation. Furthermore, users of the microscope found that it was too challenging to manipulate tiny anatomical, animal, botanical, and entomological specimens on the microscope, and with the lack of sufficient light source to illuminate the specimen, even by using a mirror on the other side of the examination table to reflect light onto the specimen, microscopic observations were still too challenging to make. Despite these challenges, microscopes were crucial for making scientific discoveries. Referred to as spontaneous generation, it was believed for centuries that insects emerged from nothing. Like, for example, maggots seeming to appear suddenly from a decaying carcass of an animal. Through the microscope, the experts of nature or naturalists were able to see eggs of maggots invisible to the naked eye. In the mid-17th century, the English naturalist Robert Hooke published a book entitled Micrographia, or Some Physiological Descriptions of Minute Bodies Made by Magnifying Glasses, in 1665, to promote the usefulness of the optical instrument and what he was able to observe through the lens, a first book of its kind. This book includes many observations of a range of specimens such as hair, vegetables, and insects he made through the microscope, and which Hooke himself actually illustrated. The most striking illustrations in Hooke's book include this profile view of a flea, depicted oversized to show the insect's previously invisible infinitesimal construction. The image folds out more than double the size of the book, simulating the effect of an invisibly small life being dramatically oversized when observed through the microscope. Hooke found beauty of God's creation and perfection in the insect's intricate body. So I'm going to quickly read you what he says about this about the flea. As for the beauty of it, the microscope manifests it to be all over adorned with a curiously polished suit of sable armor, neatly jointed and beset with multitudes of sharp pins shaped almost like porcupine quills or bright conical seal bodkins. The head is on either side, beautified with a quick and round black eye, behind each of which also appears a small cavity in which he seems to move to and fro a certain thin film beset with many small transparent hairs, which probably may be his ears. In the forepart of his head, between the two forelegs, he has two small long-jointed feelers, or rather smellers, which have 4 joints and are hairy. Between these, it has a small proboscis or probe that seems to consist of a tube and a tongue or sucker, which I've perceived him to slip in and out, end quote. His description of the observation he made through the microscope not only conveys a sense of wonder he felt in the minuscule details, but also indicates that a new vision gained through the microscope offers a totally different experience of the smallest living things, that they can be knowable and describable because one can see them. So what does this early history of the microscope have to do with portraits of nature? The drive to see, know, and describe what used to be invisible, unknowable, and indescribable laid a groundwork for microscopes to be invented and developed, and observations made through the microscope illustrating them in turn fueled more in-depth, micro-scaled studies of the natural world. Despite how scientifically accurate Robert Hooke's illustration of a flea claims to be, describing it through images and in words is still a creative act, because it emerges from Hooke's knowledge base of the subject, what his mind and eyes can perceive and comprehend, and his ability to turn it into an illustration. Thus, not only is there more to be discovered as techniques and observations improve, but there is also an endless possibility of translating what one sees into an image. From this standpoint, let's look at a couple of works by Rachel Ruysch in the exhibition. One of them is this fantastic forest floor scene with a classical facade beyond from around 1687. A prominent botanical occupant is this milk thistle, which is this large plant here, whose key characteristic includes large dark green leaves with distinct white marbling that grow up to about 20 inches wide. If you look closely at the leaves, their tight, spiny edges, slightly browned out, can be observed. Bright light from the top left corner illuminates the leaves, accentuating the myriad forms they create, some fanning out like others, some fanning out, while others in contorted dispositions. Rachel Ruysch even took into consideration the smooth texture of the leaves using the effects of light falling on their surface. Ruysch imbues a more dynamism in the leaves. The pools of dark green against the white veins are individually illuminated, evoking undulation rather than flatness. And on the left and right side of this leaf, and I brightened the details a bit so we can see them better, we can make out a presumably insect-generated hole, which is on the left, and a few brown speckles that formed outside the veins. And sucking a drop of dew on this leaf is a lizard, whose scaly surface is delineated with light yellow dots that are infinitesimal in scale, yet evenly distributed along the shape of the amphibian's body. The thistle, prominently depicted in this painting, is a motif that appears in Otto Marcius van Schriek's compositions, and that's something that the exhibition also explicates very nicely. We also learned in the exhibition about this other painting by Rachel, created roughly around 2 years prior to what we just examined. Following again the example of Van Schriek, who used actual insect specimens as a medium, Rachel pressed actual butterfly wings into wet paint and pulled them away, leaving behind the scales, and then complete the remainder of the insect using a fine brush. While this technique is truly another example of a fascinating intersection between art and science, we may take a step further and wonder if Rachel's motive for pressing into wet paint and pulling away an actual butterfly wing from the canvas, and thus leaving the scales, was to achieve a level of realism that invites the audience of her time, discerning collectors and/or naturalists, to bring out a portable handheld microscope they use for observations and examine the painted butterfly wings as if they were actual specimens. Rachel Ruysch's comparable approach to painting nature shows up in her other works. Dating to 1714, this is the largest painting she ever created, and it was for her then patron, Johann Wilhelm of Düsseldorf. And now I'm going to zoom in on one of the most readily neglected parts of this painting, the barley leaves. Ruysch meticulously rendered a precarious state of barley's thin leaves, dried and in various stages of breaking off from the stem. This can be achieved by applying different amounts of paint on the brush on a single instance, with just the right amount of paint and oil mixture to create a more viscous look. Apply the brush to the canvas with different force as a painter observed the bristle of her brush diverging in more than one direction as the paint is applied to the canvas. The finishing touch would have been applied with a very thin brush, so as not to create awkward, artificial lines that were meant to suggest the veins of the leaves. Or in this painting, which we saw earlier, every straw of hay that collectively makes up a bird's nest is rendered with likely a single bristle brush. These details are less microscopic than the previous examples we saw, but they're still very small that without the artist's keen observation of nature, microscopic vision, and her extraordinary ability to translate her observations into images, such visual effects would not have been possible. We can consider just how microscopic vision, a kind of vision informed or inspired by microscopic observations, guided artists in their approach to portraying nature. As these examples by Rachel Ruysch attest, it is in the smallness of infinitely complex dimensions of nature that one experiences a sense of wonder. By the late 18th century, some instrument makers working in Amsterdam, such as Abraham Iplar, produced high-end microscope slides that were individually housed in a case made with mahogany or stored in small ornate cabinets. Painstakingly designed, these tiny slides contain specimens from all over the world. The example at the Yale Peabody Museum, by the way, this object is smaller than the palm of my hand. It's very tiny. It contains white poppy seeds, Menelaus butterfly wings, peacock feathers, and silver ore that originate from Suriname, Brazil, the Moluccas, in present-day Indonesia, and elsewhere. A more elaborate example is Iplar's carefully curated slide cabinets. In their ornate construction and elegant arrangement, it's hard to miss the source of Iplar's design and what it invokes: cabinets of curiosities. Iplar presents to his clients that his microscope slides are not only items of luxury, but also they are a product of his carefully orchestrated design. When the various specimens come together, they collectively offer a world that the viewer had not seen before. It's a new theater of nature on a small scale, a role the microscope tradition played a noteworthy part. Part 5, pulling back the curtains. So far, we've explored the early modern notion of a microcosm that informed portrayals of nature in a number of different ways. In the final section of this lecture, I would like us to revisit the very first work we saw at the beginning of our time together. If you recall, the title of this book here on the slide is called The Wonder Theater of Nature, another way of describing the vast collection of primarily natural specimens by Levinus Vincent and Johanna van Breda. This book was published in Dutch in 1706, and then an abridged edition of it was published in Latin and French in 1719. If the date of its original Dutch publication rings a bell to anyone, which is 1706, this book was published just 1 year after the aforementioned book by Maria Sibylla Merian, The Metamorphosis of Insects of Suriname. Both of these publications received much attention in the Dutch Republic and beyond. A great deal of their appeal is because of the compelling illustrations of nature populating the pages of the publications. This is a frontispiece to a publication. It presents a highly ornate interior, furnished with compartmentalized cabinets housing jars after jars containing specimens of various animals preserved in alcohol. Above them is a portrait bust decorated with a laurel-bearing rondelle, which has an inscription Antonia Breda, a Latinized name for Anthony van Breda, who started a natural history collection in 1674 and inherited it to his sister Johanna and her husband Vincent after his death in 1693. Flanking Anthony van Breda's portrait bust are personifications of two continents, Africa on the left and America on the right, both represented in a stereotyped manner, suggesting the origins of the specimens housed in the cabinets below. Above the portrait bust stands an armillary sphere, a scientific instrument that serves as a model of the sky, which includes a thick band representing the movement of the sun. Its placement at the top of the collection signifies how the world can be brought into order through mathematical instruments. The rising sun to its right emanates rays of light, dispelling the fog of human ignorance to its left. And here, that's the title of the publication. And between the two largest cabinets at the center stands a tall statue of quote-unquote nymph who brings order to the collection. Her responsibility is reflected in a bee skep, a traditional type of beehives used for centuries, especially in the northern part of Europe. Bee skeps were made out of straws or grass, which were bundled as strands to form a robust rope and then coiled round and round to form its conical, basket, or dome-like shape, and it usually came with an opening. A colony of bees would be established in a bee skep, producing honey and beeswax. A nymph holding this bee skep could provide a dual meaning of her busy work of ordering the collection, being compared with the restless efforts of bees, and how nature can be reestablished through the work of humans. Standing beside her are two putti, one named Pattern on the left, who is holding a compass and a set square, and the other named Adornment, holding a peacock's tail and a drawing. When we zoom out a bit, framing either side of this interior are two large statues, and you can see them actually here on the left and the right, personifying the art of embroidery on the left and the art of drawing or painting on the right. These details of the frontispiece alone speak to a great deal about the Vincent van Breda collection of natural specimens. That the collection is largely based on specimens from distant locations, and the collected specimens are presented in an orderly manner and as a form of art. And this presentation of the collection is further articulated in the views of individual cabinets containing natural specimens. In this image you're seeing here, that focuses on one of the compartmentalized cabinets, we see both an impressive and orderly arrangement of specimens contained in jars. Each compartment has a large container with a specimen flanked by smaller containers. So you can see them here, every single one of them. And the compartments are separated by a shaft, spiraling, twisting shaft that is like a corkscrew. And it's a design derived from an architectural feature called a Solomonic column. And so those compartmentalized cabinets are really separated by these Solomonic column-shaped shafts here. As the name suggests, Solomonic columns were believed to have come from the Temple of Solomon, recorded in the Bible, which supposedly by ancient Roman Emperor Constantine were given to decorate the old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. When the new St. Peter's Basilica was built and completed in the 16th and early 17th century, columns inspired by the Solomonic columns were used in several areas of the church building. And there are a number of buildings in the early modern era throughout Europe featuring these columns. This design was likely incorporated into the making of Vincent and van Breda's cabinets to call to mind the biblical framework of nature as God's wondrous creation, as well as connecting their neatly organized collection to the celebrated wisdom of the biblical king of Solomon and the splendor of his temple. As the disparate books and specimen jars strewn in the ground make their way to the cabinets, they find their place in the cabinets organized by collectors. In another image, we can see that each drawer is conceived as a carefully constructed space in which specimens were arranged in artful patterns. These compositions were inspired by both Vincent's occupation as a designer and merchant of textiles, and Johanna van Breda's profession as an embroiderer. To conceive each composition, they sorted out the specimens by size, color, and shape, and drew a pattern in which the specimens would be laid. And then each specimen, especially the insects, were pinned down to the drawer one by one by Johanna. More so than the breadth of the collection itself, Johanna's meticulous work of pinning the specimens was highly praised by their contemporaries. Then every drawer, which opened individually, not only offered a visual feast to the visitors to the collection, but also presented them with a whole new way of looking at nature. Just like the wet specimens placed in compartmentalized cabinets, these pinned specimens were ordered and conformed to a new aesthetic. Each drawer is another world on a micro scale. Each cabinet housing the drawers is a compilation of small worlds. When these cabinets come together to form a microcosm, the result is a wonder theater. It may be an imaginative view of a grand hall. Whose walls are furnished from top to bottom with amassed natural specimens and some human-made objects of Vincent van Breda. Visitors to the space are examining and discussing the orderly and artful presentation of the wondrous items. If we look at the top right quadrant of this view, which is over here, there is a curtain being drawn to reveal the collector's cabinet of curiosities, dramatizing even further the amazement and a sense of awe that nature and the collection elicits, like a theater. It reminds us of this painting by the American artist Charles Wilson Peale, who depicted himself at the age of 81, pulling back a crimson curtain, a natural history museum he opened in 1784. This artistic device of a curtain suggests the theatricality of nature and the presentation of nature as a microcosm. They are both wondrous. So I would like to end our time with this detail in the foreground of the frontispiece of the publication and of its Vincent Johannes van Breda's collection. Here we observe 4 figures. On the far left is a figure representing the explorer or researcher with a dip net, a tool used for collecting natural specimens. Wearing a zodiac belt over his body signifies one's constant inquisitiveness. The explorer or researcher looks over the shoulder of nature, a crowned female figure with multiple breasts and a globe, and peers into her private parts, which she exposes by lifting a garment covering the lower half of her body, a highly sexualized and conventional way of rendering the act of, quote-unquote, discovering nature during this period. On the opposite side, 2 figures are also seated. The figure wearing a helmet made of a shell and holding an elaborate oar emblematizes seafaring, through which foreign specimens were acquired, traveled across seas, and eventually presented as wet specimens in Europe. On the far right side, the figure of an enthusiast or collector is holding a caduceus and cards, symbolizing trade, negotiation, and commerce in one hand, and a jar of wet specimen on the other. On the figure's lap is a book opened up to an illustration of a bird of paradise, a mythologized aviary animal from Asia, whose wings and legs were removed upon entering into Europe as dried specimens. These details of the frontispiece encapsulate the idea of discovery, European perception of nature, maritime voyages, and collecting practices that underpinned a range of portrayals of nature we explore today. Depictions of nature are more than attractive or creative assemblages of what is observed in life and through mediated sources like collected specimens. They speak to the micro-world of nature known, seen, and created by Europeans, whose activity of observing, collecting knowledge, and application of that knowledge by ordering and creating artful compositions played a monumental role in shaping the way they saw the macro world. To see is to create is to see. Thank you. I'm happy to take some questions. We have about 6 minutes.
Sorry, if you wouldn't mind just waiting for the microphone here.
The slide of the large theater of wonder was, did I miss it? But what, is that affiliated? Was it open to the public, affiliated with the university, or
it wasn't affiliated with the university.
Okay, so this was just idealized?
Yes, it is an idealized view, but it was indeed open to the public as long as you pay a fee to see it.
We have one coming down on that side.
Okay. All directions. All right. In the exhibit, if I remember correctly, near the end, one of the commentaries is this use of natural things from all over the world that couldn't exist in quote-unquote real life. Was she celebrating sort of the Dutch Empire's ability to collect and bring things, or was she giving us a critical lens? And sort of a critique of that exploitation. And I take it from your comments that you would probably say it's the former and not the latter, that she's fitting into this tradition of creating a microcosm of the natural, of a new world in her microscope, in her paintings.
Yeah, so thank you for that really great question. So I think in terms of Rachel Ruysch and that point of reflection towards the end of the exhibit, what I'm really trying to get at with this talk is to really think about these, the idea of creating this microcosm, and we can really go in either directions. The more of the positive, the promoting side, the advancement side of the Dutch Empire's extent of its influence and trade, and also there could be seen as a critique. So for me, I'm really trying to find a particular framework to really understand why microcosms are being formed, rather than try to really go in either directions. I think that's very difficult to really determine, and that's up for debate. So that's not the place where I'm coming from. I'm really trying to understand the guiding principles that formulates microcosm.
Mind just speaking into the
Do
microphone?
we know anything about her biography? She certainly profited and benefited in many ways, and for a woman it was amazing, but it's hard. Anyway, after hearing you and seeing that and for how long she did this, I don't know if there is any evidence that she's also presenting a critical lens on that empire building.
Right, I think that's very difficult to determine from a current standpoint, and the kind of the extant evidence that we have at the moment. Yes, I think there's a question in the back. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Given all the encoding that's happening in so many of the images we're seeing here that's revealing hidden worlds, the body, nature, and so on, as you explained so well in your talk, I'm wondering if we might be able to read some of these images encoding another kind of hidden world, if you like, irrational one, maybe an occult world, like with symbols and bits in the images that might point towards like magic or alchemy, for example. Obviously, some of these images probably aren't doing that at all, but then others might seem to be also having another level of encoding, if you like. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thank you for that great question and observation. And definitely, the notion of microcosm does have a lot of intersection with alchemy, especially in the early modern period. And I think in terms of kind of thinking about the human body and its reflection to astrology, like how it's translating to astrology and alchemy, it's definitely really present in the microcosm, microcosmic thinking for sure. And I think in terms of understanding the portrayals of nature, I think that's where a little bit more kind of another level encoding, like you mentioned, can be applied to understand these portrayals of nature. And at the same time, I think that's another area that really needs to be explored deeper in the scholarship. And I'm really glad that you pointed out for further development. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your attention, and it's great to spend the last few moments with you.